At this very moment, around 40% of adults are living with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. That's almost half the population walking around with a condition that significantly increases their risk of dying from any cause, not just diabetes-related complications. And that's the part that doctors don't seem to tell you. You go to the doctor with some symptoms. They diagnose you with a disease caused by your lifestyle. And instead of offering help or education to change that lifestyle, they give you a medication instead, or they tell you to come back in 6 months so they can recheck your HbA1c. The world we live in is absolutely crazy, and here's what most people don't seem to realize. The problem isn't high blood sugar itself, the problem is insulin resistance, the condition that's been building silently in the background for decades before anyone gets diagnosed, largely driven by the modern food environment, ultra-processed foods, constant access to refined carbs, and lifestyles that push our metabolism into storage mode 24 hours a day. Insulin resistance is linked to all of the major diseases that kill us. Heart disease, strokes, kidney failure, dementia, even certain cancers. The damage has been accumulating in your heart, in your brain, in your blood vessels, your kidneys years before you notice anything is wrong. And that's the scary part. And one of the biggest drivers of insulin resistance is repeated large glucose spikes. I'm Dr. Alex, and I've spent the last 10 years working in emergency medicine, watching people arrive with diseases that didn't start suddenly, but built slowly over decades. What this channel does is it explains what actually drives those conditions and what you can realistically do to avoid them. If you find this helpful, then subscribing to the channel really does help get this information to more people. And if you are subscribed, then thank you so much. Anyway, here are 20 evidence-based strategies to reduce your glucose spikes, reverse insulin resistance, and lower your risk of prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, or even reverse it if you've already been diagnosed. Now, these aren't ranked in order of importance, because different strategies will matter for different people depending on where you're starting from, but all of them work, and all of them are things that you can start doing today. First on the list is building muscle through resistance training, and this is one of the most underrated tools that we have for reversing insulin resistance. Muscle tissue is the largest glucose storage site in the body. When you contract your muscles during exercise, they pull glucose out of your bloodstream without needing as much insulin. That's partly why a walk after a meal lowers blood sugar so effectively. But beyond the immediate effect, having more muscle mass fundamentally changes how your body handles glucose long term. More muscle means more capacity to store glucose, and it also means that your cells become more sensitive to insulin even when you're not exercising. The thing is, you don't need to become a bodybuilder to see these benefits. Just 2 to 3 sessions per week of just basic resistance training, these work, whether that's just lifting weights, using resistance bands, or even body weight exercises like squats or press-ups. These are enough to start shifting the needle. What matters most is consistency and progressive challenge. Your muscles need to be asked to do something difficult in order to adapt and grow, and as they do grow, your metabolic health improves along with them. Moving on to number 2, and this one is about reducing your glucose spikes, not necessarily eliminating carbs altogether. So there's a persistent myth that all carbs are the enemy if you have insulin resistance, but that's not how the body actually works. Carbohydrates are just chains of glucose molecules, and your body is perfectly capable of handling them when they're delivered in a controlled way. The problem comes from when glucose floods into your bloodstream too quickly and in too large a quantity. That's when you get the big spike. And that's when insulin has to surge to compensate. So the goal isn't to avoid carbs, it's to avoid rapid, massive rises in blood glucose. You can eat carbohydrates and still protect your metabolic health by choosing sources that release glucose more slowly, eating them in a smaller portion, and combining them with other foods that slow digestion. What you're trying to do is flatten the curve. A gentle rise in glucose is manageable, but a vertical spike is metabolically expensive and drives insulin resistance over time. Number 3 is about liquid calories, and this is one of the fastest ways to worsen insulin resistance without even realizing it. We're talking about fruit juices, smoothies, sugary coffees, energy drinks, even seemingly healthy drinks like coconut water or shop-bought kombucha can deliver glucose into your bloodstream at an alarming speed. When you drink sugar, there's no chewing, there's no fiber, there's no delay. It hits your stomach and gets absorbed almost immediately, and that causes one of the sharpest glucose and insulin spikes that you can create. Even fruit smoothies, which people often think of as healthy, they can be problematic as well. Blending fruit breaks down the fiber structure and makes the natural sugars much more readily available. You end up consuming far more sugar in one go than you would do if you just ate the fruit whole and your pancreas has to respond aggressively. The insulin surge that follows doesn't just lower your blood sugar, it often drops it too far, leaving you tired and hungry again an hour later as your blood glucose is lower than it should be. That cycle of spike and crash is one of the most damaging patterns for long-term metabolic health. So, if you're serious about reversing insulin resistance, then liquid calories need to be one of the first things to go. Number 4 is all about food composition, specifically pairing carbohydrates with protein and fat. So, when you eat carbs on their own, they digest quickly and glucose enters your bloodstream in one concentrated wave. But when you add protein or fat to the same meal, digestion slows down. Protein stimulates digestive hormones that delay stomach emptying, and fat physically slows the movement of food through your gut. The result is a much gentler, slower release of glucose into your bloodstream. This doesn't mean that you need to turn every meal into something complicated, it just means thinking in combinations. If you're having toast, then add eggs or peanut butter or something like that. If you're eating rice, then include chicken or fish and some vegetables cooked in olive oil. If you're snacking on fruit, then have it with a handful of nuts or a piece of cheese or some yogurt. These small adjustments make a significant difference to how your body responds, and they also help you feel fuller for longer, which naturally reduces the temptation to snack frequently. And this brings us to number 5, which is stopping constant snacking. This is a harder message to deliver because we've been told for years that eating small, frequent meals keeps your metabolism active, but that advice doesn't hold up when you look at what constant eating does to insulin. Every time you eat, even if it's just a small snack, your pancreas releases insulin. If you're eating every 2 or 3 hours throughout the day, then insulin never really gets a chance to fall back to baseline. It stays elevated, and that prolonged elevation is one of the core drivers of insulin resistance. Your body needs periods where insulin is low. That's when fat can be mobilized for energy. That's when cells can reset their sensitivity to insulin, and that's when repair processes that get suppressed by insulin can take place. If you're eating constantly, then you're blocking all of that. So, one of the simplest and most effective strategies is to create clear gaps between meals. Let yourself get genuinely hungry before eating again. And that's something that in this modern world, we're just not used to. It's okay to be hungry. It might feel uncomfortable at first if you're used to grazing, but within a few days, your body adapts and those hunger signals become much more manageable. Number 6 is managing chronic stress. And this is something that gets overlooked massively in conversations about blood sugar. So, stress doesn't just make you feel anxious or tired, it directly raises your blood glucose. When you're stressed, your body releases cortisol and adrenaline, which signals to your liver to release stored glucose into your bloodstream. Now, that's useful if you're genuinely in danger and need quick energy to respond. But if you're chronically stressed, sitting at a desk, or lying awake at night worrying, then glucose has nowhere to go. It just sits in your blood and insulin has to deal with it. Over time, chronic stress becomes a hidden source of insulin resistance that's completely independent of what you're eating. You could be following a perfect diet and still struggle with high blood sugar if your stress hormones are constantly elevated. So managing stress isn't a luxury or something to get onto eventually. It's a core part of metabolic health. It might mean structured practices like meditation or breath work, or it might mean something simpler like protecting time for rest, or even speaking to a counselor, or speaking with your family or friends, or saying no to things that drain you, or spending time in nature. There's so much that you can do, but whatever works for you, it has to be regular. Number 7 is all about the order in which you eat your food. And this is one of those strategies that seems almost too simple to matter, but the research behind it is really solid. So if you eat the components of your meal in a specific sequence, which is fiber first, then protein and fat, and then carbohydrates last, you can significantly reduce the glucose spike that meal produces. The reason this works is because fiber, especially from veg, forms a kind of a physical mesh in your stomach and your small intestine that slows down the absorption of everything that comes after it. So if you start your meal with a salad or some cooked veg, then move your way onto protein and fat, and then finish with your carbs, the carbs get absorbed much more slowly. The glucose rise is gentler and insulin doesn't have to surge as aggressively. Some studies have shown reductions in post-meal glucose of up to 40% just from changing the order without changing the food itself. It's a small behavioral tweak that costs nothing and fits into any eating pattern. A really great tip that I do in my family is as the main meal is cooking, I cut up a whole cucumber, 4 carrots, 4 sticks of celery, and then my wife and we just eat our way through those with a whole tub of hummus, chatting about our day while the main meal cooks. And it's a great time that I really look forward to every day because not only does it load you with fiber and protein and fat, but it's also just a really nice piece of family time. Moving on to number 8, and this is all about sleep. So poor sleep is one of the fastest ways to wreck your insulin sensitivity, and it happens almost immediately. Even one night of short or disrupted sleep can impair your glucose tolerance the next day. Your cells become less responsive to insulin, your appetite hormones get dysregulated, and you crave high sugar, high fat foods to compensate for the energy deficit. Do that repeatedly over weeks or months, which as healthcare professionals we do all the time with our shift work, then you've created a metabolic disaster. What's particularly important here isn't just the duration of sleep, but the consistency and the quality. Going to bed and waking up at roughly the same time every day helps regulate your circadian rhythm, which in turn regulates insulin sensitivity. Your body is more efficient at handling glucose during certain times of the day, and sleep is what keeps that rhythm stable. So prioritizing 7 to 10 hours of sleep in a dark, cool room without screens before bed, it's not just about feeling rested, it's about protecting your metabolism. Number 9 is avoiding what I call naked sugars. So that's any sugary food eaten on its own without anything else to slow it down. Things like a biscuit by itself, a handful of sweets, a pastry on an empty stomach. These create some of the largest, most rapid glucose spikes that you can generate because there's nothing to buffer the sugar. It gets absorbed almost instantly, and your insulin response has to be equally aggressive. Now, the solution isn't necessarily to never eat those foods. Though reducing them is clearly helpful, it's to never eat them alone. If you're going to have something sweet, then have it right at the end of a meal where you've already eaten protein, fat, and fiber. That way, the sugar gets absorbed much more slowly as part of a mixed meal. The spike is smaller, the insulin response is gentler, and the metabolic cost is much lower, right? So we're halfway through at this point. So number 10 is about focusing on insulin itself, not just glucose. Most people with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes only ever get their blood glucose measured, but glucose is a late marker. By the time it's elevated, you've already had years of high insulin compensating in the background. Insulin rises first, sometimes a decade before glucose becomes abnormal. So if you really want to catch insulin resistance early or track whether you're reversing it, then you need to measure fasting insulin, not just fasting glucose. The units for fasting insulin are a bit complicated, so let me just give you the numbers. In the US, you ideally want it below 5 and certainly below 7. In the UK and Europe, you're ideally looking for under about 35 and definitely below 50. If your fasting insulin is higher than that, even if your blood glucose and HbA1c are still normal, then you're already insulin resistant. And this is the key point. The strategies that lower insulin, things like reducing meal frequency, cutting out ultra-processed foods, exercising regularly, and managing stress, these are the same strategies that prevent blood sugar from ever becoming a problem in the first place. Insulin resistance comes first. High glucose comes later. Now, in the UK, your GP generally won't offer a fasting insulin test, not because it's unimportant, but because it's just not part of routine NHS screening. So if you want this information, it's usually worth going private. Yes, it costs some money, but if that test helps you catch insulin resistance early, before diabetes, before heart disease, before cognitive decline, then it's one of the best investments that you can make. Don't wait for a diabetes diagnosis to take this seriously. By the time glucose is high, insulin resistance has often been there for years. Get your fasting insulin checked now because the goal isn't just to live longer, is to make the later years of your life healthy, independent, and free from preventable hospital appointments for things like angina, strokes, or dementia. Number 11 is reducing ultra-processed foods, and this goes far beyond just sugar and carbs. So, ultra-processed foods are things that have been industrially manufactured to make money with ingredients that you wouldn't find in a home kitchen. Things like emulsifiers, stabilizers, artificial flavors, and preservatives. These foods are engineered to be hyper palatable and easy to overeat, but they also seem to independently worsen insulin resistance, even when calorie intake is controlled. Part of the problem is that they're broken down so easily that they deliver nutrients, especially glucose, extremely quickly. There's no structural integrity, there's no fiber, there's nothing that requires effort to chew or digest. But there's also emerging evidence that some of the additives themselves may disrupt your gut bacteria or interfere with metabolic signaling. The simplest rule is if it comes in a package with more than 5 ingredients, or if you don't recognize most of those ingredients, then it's probably ultra-processed. Stick to whole foods as much as possible. And just remember that if it didn't exist 100 red years ago, then it's probably not good for you. Number 12 is moving after meals. You don't need to go for a run or do anything intense. Just a 10 or 15-minute walk is enough. When you move, your muscles contract, and that contraction allows them to take up glucose from your blood without needing insulin. It's almost like a back door into the cell that bypasses the usual insulin pathway. Now, this is especially powerful right after eating because that's when glucose is entering your bloodstream most rapidly. If you can go for a walk within 30 minutes of finishing a meal, then you'll blunt the glucose spike significantly. And if you do this consistently day after day, then it trains your muscles to be better at glucose disposal even when you're not exercising. It really is a good hack here, and it's a compounding habit that costs nothing and fits into almost any schedule. Lucky number 13 is aligning your eating with your circadian rhythm. So, your body's ability to handle glucose isn't constant throughout the day. It's controlled by your internal clock, and that clock makes you most insulin sensitive in the morning and least sensitive at night. What that means is that a meal eaten at 8 a.m. will cause a smaller glucose and insulin response than the exact same meal eaten at 10 p.m. This is why eating late, especially eating carbohydrates late, is so metabolically expensive. Your body just isn't set up to handle it efficiently. So, one of the simplest shifts that you can make is to front load your food intake earlier in the day, have a substantial breakfast, have a decent lunch, and then maybe a lighter dinner, or just move it earlier in the day, and try to finish all of this eating at least 2 to 3 hours before bed. That gives your body, what that does is that music, it gives your body time to process the meal while insulin sensitivity is still relatively high. And it also improves your sleep quality. Number 14 is about getting the right tests done, specifically measuring earlier markers of insulin resistance before glucose becomes abnormal. Fasting glucose is useful, but by the time it's elevated, you're often well into pre-diabetes or diabetes. Now, fasting insulin, as I mentioned earlier, rises years before that. A normal HbA1c is considered below 42 in the UK, but ideally, you want it below 39. Now in the US, that's roughly below 5.7, with an ideal target closer to 5.4 or lower. The lower end of normal matters because HbA1c doesn't suddenly become harmful at the cutoff. Risk rises gradually. Now you can also learn a lot by looking at your triglycerides and your HDL cholesterol together. If your triglycerides are high and your HDL is low, then that's a strong signal of insulin resistance, even if your glucose still looks fine. The triglyceride to HDL ratio is sometimes called the atherogenic index, and it's one of the most useful markers of metabolic dysfunction. As a rough guide, in the US, a triglyceride to HCl ratio above 3 suggests insulin resistance, while below 2 is much healthier. In the UK and Europe, where the numbers are reported a bit differently, a ratio above 1 is concerning, and lower than that is obviously better. So don't rely on a single normal blood sugar result. Ask for HbA1c. Ask for fasting insulin if your doctor can do that, and a full lipid profile, and look at the pattern rather than just one number in isolation. Catching insulin resistance early gives you years, sometimes decades, to reverse it before it turns into diabetes or heart disease or other serious problems. Number 15 is creating longer insulin-free periods during each day. And this is really about giving your body time to recover metabolically. So every time you eat, insulin goes up. If you eat constantly, then insulin never comes down. But if you create defined eating windows, for example, eating all of your food within a 10 or 12-hour window each day, then you give in a chance to fall back to baseline for several hours. That's when your cells can start to reset their sensitivity. It's also when your body can shift into fat burning mode because insulin blocks fat metabolism. You don't need to do anything extreme necessarily. You don't need to skip meals or fast for days. Just stop eating after dinner and don't start again until breakfast the next morning. That might sound obvious, but a lot of people snack late into the evening or even start eating first thing in the morning before they're even hungry. And this is actually something that I struggled with personally, but it does get easier, I promise you. Compressing your eating into a consistent daily window is one of the most sustainable metabolic interventions there is. Number 16 is moderating or even eliminating alcohol. And this is something that most people don't really connect to insulin resistance, but the relationship is really, really strong. Alcohol disrupts blood sugar regulation in multiple ways. It interferes with your liver's ability to release glucose, which can cause reactive low blood sugar. It also promotes fat accumulation around your organs, particularly visceral fat, which is the type that's most strongly linked to insulin resistance. And it also wrecks your sleep, which, as we've already discussed, immediately impairs insulin sensitivity the next day. Even just moderate drinking, like a couple of glasses of wine several times a week, can be enough to slow or stall progress if you're trying to reverse insulin resistance. It doesn't mean that you can never drink, although clearly none is better, but it does mean being honest about how much and how often, and recognizing that it's working against your metabolic goals. For some people, cutting it out entirely for a few months is what finally allows other changes to take hold. Number 17 is prioritizing fiber at every single meal. And this is one of the most consistently beneficial things that you can do for your glucose control. Fiber, particularly soluble fiber from veg and legumes and oats and certain fruits, they slow digestion and blunt the absorption of glucose. It also feeds beneficial bacteria in your gut, which produce these short-chain fatty acids that improve insulin sensitivity. The target that most people should aim for is around 30 grams of fiber per day, but most people in the UK are only getting around 15 or 20, so there's a big gap there. The easiest way to close it is to include veg at every single meal, not just dinner. Add spinach to your eggs, have a side salad with lunch, snack on a carrot or nuts or berries instead of crisps. It really doesn't need to be complicated, and the more you do it, the easier this routine gets. Number 18 is focusing on visceral fat reduction, not just total weight loss. So visceral fat is the fat stored around your internal organs, particularly in your abdomen. It's metabolically active, meaning that it releases inflammatory signals and hormones that directly drive insulin resistance. You can be a normal weight on the scale and still have high levels of visceral fat if you're inactive, if you eat poorly, or if you have a genetic predisposition. Waist circumference is a better marker of visceral fat than BMI. BMI is just useless, to be honest. For men, a waist circumference of over 94 centimeters is concerning, and over 102 is pretty high risk. For women, it's 80 and 88 centimeters, respectively. So even if your weight isn't changing dramatically, if your waist is shrinking, then you're losing visceral fat. And that's what matters most for reversing insulin resistance. Resistance training and reducing ultra-processed foods are two of the most effective ways to target this type of fat specifically. Number 19 is all about medications this time, and this is a really nuanced point. So medications like Metformin or GLP-1 agonist can absolutely help to lower your blood glucose and reduce complications. They're really useful tools, especially if insulin resistance is severe or if lifestyle changes aren't really working, but they don't fix the underlying problem. They manage the symptoms. Metformin makes your cells more sensitive to insulin and reduces glucose output from your liver. GLP-1 drugs, they slow digestion and they reduce your appetite. But neither one of them reverses the root cause, which is chronic metabolic overload from diet, inactivity, stress, and poor sleep. So medication should be seen as a support, not a replacement for the fundamentals. If you're on medication, then that's fine. Use it. I'm sure your doctor has prescribed it for a reason, but don't let it become an excuse to avoid the harder work of changing habits. The goal should always be to need less medication over time, not more. And finally, number 20 on the list is about consistency over perfection. Insulin resistance doesn't develop overnight, and it doesn't reverse overnight either. It builds up over years and years, and it takes sustained effort over months to turn it around. But the good news is that the effort doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need to follow every single one of these strategies flawlessly. What matters is that you pick a few, you apply them consistently, and you let them compound. Small changes repeated daily have a far greater impact than dramatic changes that only last a week. Walk after meals most days, sleep well most nights, eat whole foods most of the time. Over weeks and months, your fasting insulin will start to drop, your energy will stabilize, your body composition will improve, and your long-term risk of diabetes and heart disease and all of the other complications that come with insulin resistance, they will fall significantly. You really don't have to be perfect with this. It's about being persistent and playing the long game. The habits that you practice in your 30s, 40s, and 50s are the ones that determine whether your 70s, 80s, and 90s are active, independent, and enjoyable, or dominated by medications, appointments, and preventable disease. Small daily choices don't feel powerful in the moment, but over years, they quietly decide how well you age.